Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. As Jeff mentioned, we're sister organizations, and we have pretty much the same format that Whitehall Meditation start at 7, then at 8:30, and we have Dharma talks and so forth, and share resources. So it's really been great to come into Charlottesville. And basically, what what I try to accomplish, or in terms of my teaching, is be very practical. What can we, learn from the Buddha's teachings and actually apply it to our lives? And there's really a lot to apply. And maybe it's because I'm from a medical background or whatever, but I consider the Buddha to be like a physician, a specialist. And his disease that he specialized in was suffering. And in fact, he said that in one of his teachings. He said, "What I teach now, as before, O monks, is suffering and the cessation of suffering." So when you think of suffering as being a disease, it kind of has two advantages to it. One is, in terms of a disease, we can really put a little distance between our suffering, because if we consider it to be a disease, it's something that maybe we can do something about it. And also because everybody suffers. Everybody gets dissatisfied, frustrated, maybe even angry, so forth and so on. So it's a universal thing. And here we have a specialist 2,600 years ago who was dealing with this and came up with some real practical things. After the Buddha, which means, of course, the awakened one, after he meditated under the Bodhi tree, he came up with what he called the Four Noble Truths, and what I call the principles of suffering. So if you look at the principles of suffering like a disease, every disease has symptoms. And so we all know the symptoms. Dissatisfaction, we don't often call it suffering, but we just use that because that's a word used in the teaching. We get frustrated with a lot of things, and we can really, get very, very frustrated. So our dissatisfaction kind of has a range to it. And like a disease, it has a cause. So, for example, a patient who is coughing, has a fever, has a productive cough, we could say, well, that disease is pneumonia. And what is the cause of that disease? Well, we know it's the pneumococcus or perhaps some other bacteria or whatever. But with suffering, the Buddha said, yes, suffering has a cause. And the cause, just to put it in the vernacular, is we want life to be other than it is. Think of any time that you're frustrated. Isn't it really because you want things to be different? And so, okay, it's nice to know the cause. You could say that, but okay, so what do we do about it? And so with the third principle, the Buddha said, there is cessation of suffering. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. But suffering ceases when we stop clinging to things. And we'll go a little bit more about, what clinging is all about. And then with the fourth principle of suffering, so we've got the symptoms, we got the cause, we got the cure, but there's a management plan. And the management plan is what the Buddha called the Eightfold Path. And really, all of the teachings of the Buddha in terms of what we do about it come from various components of the Eightfold Path. And so the Eightfold Path, that's another 3 or 4 Dharma talks in and of itself, really consists of the 8 steps, and they're not really steps in any order, but dividing it into 3 parts. So the first 2 parts are what we call the wisdom component. Because if you're going to do anything about suffering, you really have to understand how suffering occurs and what intentions that we should take in life to really avoid suffering. So there's the wisdom from the first 2 steps. The next 3 steps are called the virtue steps. And the virtue steps are how we lead a skillful life. And basically, how can we work with our speech? So one of them is called right speech. How do you work with that? Another is work with our actions. And so that comes up with the 5 precepts about living a skillful life. And then the third one is actually called skillful livelihood. Because what we do 8 hours a day, if we're not retired or even longer, we spend a lot of time at it. And so there's a lot of things going on with that. And then the last part of the Eightfold Path, the last 3 steps, are what I call the practice component. And that's really right effort. How can we put a right effort into it in dealing with some of the unskillful things that happen? How can we be mindful? So we got right mindfulness or skillful mindfulness. And then we have concentration. And as I led the meditation, I consider meditation to be of really 3 components, but 2 of the important components are, first of all, practicing our concentration by using mindfulness of the breath so we can focus our mind. And then the next one is insight meditation or Vipassana, where we can actually be observing the mind. So all of the Eightfold Path is really a very rich, fertile ground for what we can do about how do we deal with our suffering and frustration. So what I want to talk about tonight, in the second step, in the wisdom component, we call that skillful intention. So what are the 3 intentions that you should consider strongly in adopting how you want to live your life? And intention just means you have the intention to do it. Not that you're going to be successful at it all the time, but it's just 3 areas that you can direct yourself. And these 3 areas are, first of all, letting go, which we're going to talk about tonight. The other 2 are practicing loving kindness, as I mentioned in the meditation. And the third one is practicing compassion. So letting go is something we deal with ourselves. But then, once we can deal with letting go ourselves, then we can really move to the other 2, which are really being out of ourselves. Practicing loving kindness for others and compassion, but it also includes self-compassion and giving loving kindness to ourselves. So it's very, very simple what the Buddha said. He said, these 3 things, if you can practice letting go, loving kindness, and compassion, that'll keep you occupied, and you really won't have a lot of room to do unskillful things. So let's talk about, letting go. So what is letting go? Well, letting go is really about abandoning our attachments, the things that we're attached to. And as the Buddha mentioned in the 3rd principle of suffering, when we let go of our clinging, suffering ceases. So, to use another terminology, there's craving. Now, it was interesting, a few years ago, I was down at a conference in Texas, and there's this big mall, the Galleria, and I was going up the escalator, and they had this sign, and it said, "We have everything to satisfy your every craving." And when you think about it, and I took a picture of that sign, I thought, that is really it, These people that do the advertising, they've got it down. Because you go in there, they present something, and you start craving it. Well, craving is one thing, but what does craving lead to? When you really crave something, then you transition almost invisibly into clinging. And clinging is really the problem. Because we want something, we crave it, but when we start to cling to it, it really means that we just have to have it. We just can't do without it. And we think of ways that we can get it. And we're so attached to that it's a real problem. And we can, you all know the feeling of craving. When you feel that something, you really like to have, for example, we also feel clinging. But we may deny it or not recognize it. But craving is usually a pleasant feeling. Clinging is an unpleasant feeling. Because if you're duty-bound to have it, you've not been given it. If you had it, you wouldn't, be wanting it. If you have that wanting so deep, if you really think about it and look at your body, and this is where your body is sending you messages, there's a real restlessness and worry about it because you may not get it. You've got to have it. So the bodily feelings are very important. But then you might ask the question, it's a really good question, is why do we cling? And what do we cling to? We do it all the time, but I don't think we recognize that that's what we're doing. So really, clinging is really what I would term our deluded way of seeking happiness. Our deluded way of seeking happiness. And what is a delusion? What does that really mean? Delusion means we don't really understand what's really happening. So we're deluded, and the Buddha used the term ignorant, because we're just ignorant of what is really going on in life. And so the delusion is that we believe that things are permanent, able to give lasting satisfaction, and are who we are. They're ourselves. When in fact, as I mentioned in the meditation, the opposite is actually true. So let's look at that. Why does our delusion manifest itself? So let's talk about people and relationships. Those are good things to have. But what happens when attachment steps in? We get so attached to the relationship because we think it's permanent, we spend all of our time making it permanent instead of really enjoying the relationship. That's where jealousy arrives. In a relationship with someone, you spend all the time worrying that that person doesn't love you enough or they're going to leave. And so, therefore, the whole relationship is destroyed by the attachment that you have. So the frustration that comes up in relationships is because we're attached to something. We're attached to really making that relationship permanent, our belief that it's going to give us lasting satisfaction all the time, and when it doesn't, we get frustrated and we suffer. Let's look at things, material things. We derive short-term happiness from these things. But what happens sometimes is that we want to possess those things. And so we spend a lot of our time in possession rather than just seeing the things for what they are. And as you've probably heard other people say, our possessions end up owning us rather than us owning the possessions. Spending, all of your time worrying about how that possession is going to change because we think it's permanent. This is kind of an interesting month of September for me because we bought 2 cars. We have a 07 Toyota that my wife drives that was nearing the end of life. And then I wanted to get a car for myself that had all the safety features. I had a car that I bought in 2012. And so when you buy a new car, what is the first thing that happens that gives you frustration? The first dent, right? Or somebody opens the door and dings your door and so forth. So you're looking at that car, it's just pristine, and then you start worrying. You start driving very carefully for the first few days because you don't want to get hit and so forth. And as Bonnie Gunnar says, it's easier to look at a possession as if it were already dinged and broken because it's not permanent. It's going to change. It's always changing. But we don't recognize that. It's the permanence, the thing that we think that car is going to give us lasting satisfaction or whatever we do. So material objects are also a problem that we have in terms of our attachment. And then another area, ideas, beliefs, and opinions. Now, we're certainly attached to those. But what's the problem? And what does the attachment really consist of? Well, if you think about it, and if you're really to be non-judgmental about it, we really cling to ideas, beliefs, and opinions because we think they define who we are. And we think of ourselves in that way as being permanent. And we think that these beliefs are permanent. I mean, just look what's going on today in politics. How we've gotten really a polarized situation. That we look at one party and they're defined as this, and then we say we're defined as that. Others are the other way. So we're really attached to our beliefs. And what that does to us, we spend so much time stuck and frozen on our beliefs that we're not flexible at all. We're not trying to work things out. We're just stuck with that belief because that's really what we think it's all about. So I'd like to quote Baniganara or Bani G. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He is a monk from Sri Lanka. He's up at the Bhavana Society, which is located just west of Winchester. And he was also the teacher of one of my teachers, Matt Flickstein. And he has written a number of really wonderful books. And one of them I really recommend is 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness, where he talks about the Eightfold Path. But he notes, letting go is the opposite of desire or attachment. Think of it as generosity in the highest sense. Along the Buddhist path, we will have the opportunity to give away or let go of everything that holds us back from our goal of the highest happiness. Possessions, people, beliefs, opinions, even our attachment to our own mind and body. He goes on, when people hear this, they sometimes start to worry. They think that to follow the Buddha's teachings, they have to give everything away and join a monastery. Though becoming a monk or a nun is indeed our way of practicing generosity, most people can let go in the midst of busy, family-centered lives. Most people can let go in what we're doing right now. We don't have to be a monk or a nun. It's just a little bit perhaps more difficult, although I've heard sometimes that in the monasteries there are a lot of jealousy and everything that goes on as well. It's not the perfect atmosphere either, but perhaps gives a little bit different environment for mindfulness. So he says, what we need to reject is not the things we have. What we need to reject is not the things we have, but rather our mistaken sense that these are our possessions. Our mistaken sense that these are our possessions. So when we have material objects, we have relationships, we have ideas and so forth, we think of it as they're just out there. They're there for us to interact with, but we don't own them. It's that mistaken belief that we own these things, and that's what causes us to suffer. And he says we need to let go of our habit of clinging to the people and the material things in our lives and to our ideas, beliefs, and opinions. So he's really outlined 3 categories here: people, material objects, and the ideas, beliefs, and opinions. So it comes down to really the key part of the talk. I've really said, okay, letting go is something important. We can see suffering if we let go. And you get a feeling, how powerful attachments are. They say, okay, Bob, well, that's all great, but how do we do it? How do we actually let go? What is the process? And so, first of all, we need to know that attachment is the act of grasping at and clinging to the various aspects of life. Detachment is the opposite of attachment, but that's not what we're talking about. Because detachment is actually pushing away or denying our desires and tendency to cling. So that means we're pushing things. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to have this relationship. I'm not going to have these ideas or whatever. I'm going to just detach myself from them and be free. But that's not what we're talking about at all. What we're talking about is non-attachment. Non-attachment, which is neither attachment nor detachment. And as Matt Flickstein defined non-attachment, he said it's living from a place of presence, where we honor each experience, including our desires, without grasping or resisting what is occurring. It has a quality of spaciousness, and it reflects the ability to live in the present moment. Let me say that again. Non-attachment is living from the place of presence. We're in the now, where we honor each experience, including our desires. And honoring each experience means we're experiencing the experience. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about mindfulness. Mindfulness is paying attention moment to moment to what is. So we can't honor the experience unless we're being mindful of it to see what it really is, without grasping or resisting what is occurring. It has a quality of spaciousness, and it reflects the ability to live in the present moment. So Bonnie G goes on to talk a little bit more about this. And he says, when we begin to practice mindfulness of letting go, we often stumble on fear. Fear arises because of an insecure, emotional, or greedy attachment to ideas, concepts, feelings, or physical objects, including our own body. It can also be caused by coming into contact with something that we do not understand or whose outcome is uncertain. And so it's important to appreciate the role of fear in letting go. Because let's look at a relationship and jealousy. Doesn't jealousy occur because there's fear of that other person leaving? Isn't that what really the root cause is? And so you spend all the time being jealous or watching what the other person is doing or whatever, thinking, this relationship has got to last, it's got to last. And you're not really in the relationship. You're in your mind with fearful thoughts about what's going to happen to the relationship. Or it's like thinking about your car. It's there in the garage, but when you're out driving it or when somebody else is driving it, something's going to happen to it. So you can see how your mind gets occupied with all these thoughts. So letting go is really letting go of fear. Fear is really the anticipation of something bad, catastrophic that's going to happen. And the Buddha described 4 areas where we can really feel that fear. Some of you may have heard of the 8 worldly winds. And that's what the Buddha described as our life, the things we deal with. And so of the 8, they're in opposites. And the first thing we deal with is gain and loss. And we're all in for gaining things, but we're not really up for losing things. The other one is with pleasure and pain. We're all for pleasure, but pain is not anything we want to deal with. Another is praise, and the opposite of that is criticism. We love people to praise us, but criticism, that's something else again. And the last one is what I call fame or repute and disrepute, where people aren't holding us, in a high image. So I think as we grow older, we've kind of understand that we experience all 8 of these conditions. But when we were growing up or whatever, our life strategy was, let's go for gain, let's go for pleasure, let's go for praise, let's go for repute. And how disappointed we are when the others come in. And that's where fear comes in. Because we fear that we're going to lead a lost, painful, critical, and disreputable life, that people aren't going to see us. And you can see what the attachment is. The attachment is really not having that. We're committed to not having that rather than just being with whatever occurs. So there are a couple of practical steps that I'd like to share with you, on how we can deal with this and really feel it. So actually, I forgot to pass this out, but Jeff, if I get your help here, I'd like you to take one of these index cards. So what I want to share with you is what I call the letting go contemplation. And this is a shortened version of this. And in fact, this is being recorded, right, Liz? Okay, so what I'm going to do is, I think I've done for the last talks, I'm going to add a recap to this talk. So you'll get this talk that'll be attached to whatever shows up on the web. So in terms of being able to practice this and going. So basically, the letting go contemplation is a very powerful contemplation. And we'll do it just with 1 card tonight. But it can be done with 10. So I'm going to go over this exercise with you. And so I urge you to follow along and participate in this. So in order to be in touch with your clinging, you can practice this letting go contemplation. It's very powerful, and it may bring up a lot of strong emotions. So we'll go through the exercise tonight, but I can still remember where I was and when it was that I did this in the full Monty in terms of the contemplation. But it really leads to a greater realization of non-attachment. So in this contemplation, we experience the letting go of our attachment to the various aspects of life to which we normally cling. We're not trying to cultivate detachment. We want to learn to live spontaneously, trusting life as it arises from moment to moment, and that's really the non-attachment. So this is not possible as long as we cling to anything, no matter how precious it appears to be. Okay, so on the index card that you're holding, and if you don't have a pen or just use the end to think of you're writing something down on it, write one of the most important things to you in your life. You can write a child's name on a card, the name of your significant other, your health, your eyesight, your body, your house, your financial nest egg, a specific piece of art, an heirloom, the ability to travel, your career, your memory, your intelligence, music, strength, creative ability, and so forth. So surely out of all those categories, there's something that you really feel is very important in your life. So now what I want you to do is to imagine that you're in the process of dying. It can be from cancer, an accident, or even old age. You have very little time left. After your dying process becomes clear in your mind, say goodbye to that possession, experience, or person, knowing that you will never encounter that circumstance or individual again. Fully drop into the experience, moving beyond a mere intellectual level of process. If you close your eyes, notice the feeling in your body. You're dying. You have very little time left. You have no choice but to say goodbye to that possession, experience, or person, knowing that you will never, ever encounter that circumstance or individual again. Fully drop into the experience, moving beyond a mere intellectual level of process. And then notice that feeling in your body. Is it unpleasant, pleasant, or neither unpleasant nor pleasant? So you may come to the point where you're unable to say goodbye, or to feel whole and complete without that person or experience that is on the card. When this occurs, it means that you are still attached. Either keep working at the process or acknowledge that you're unable to let go at this time. So this is something that obviously you can't do in a period of just a few minutes. But when you can say goodbye, rip up the card to signify that you have let it go and throw the torn up card in the garbage can. After ripping up the card, spend some time realizing that you are still whole and complete without that person or experience in your life. Keep working at it until you know that your well-being and serenity does not depend on what you no longer have. Your well-being and serenity does not depend on what you no longer have. So, just to give you one example, I've got 2 Jack Russell Terriers. Got Tessie, who's 11, and Sophie, who her birthday was today, turned 8. And so sometimes Tessie always comes up with me to my office, and she lies down there, and I look at her, and I have to admit, I'm very attached to Tessie. And to think that, one day she's not going to be there, or I'm going to die, and she may be still here. And you can the feeling in the body. And so you end up worrying about that rather than enjoying her just there lying with one thing about animals, I don't think they really know they're going to die. They don't have that burden that we do. But it's really just a matter of shifting, just knowing that nothing's permanent. Nothing's going to give us lasting satisfaction. And it's not who we are. So why not just enjoy Tessie's company and think about all this worrying is just thoughts going in the mind. So this is really, with whatever you selected, this is the process of letting go. You're not detaching yourself. You're just being realistic in terms of what is. And this is what we talk about being mindfulness. That mindful, we know what is means it's impermanent. It can't give us lasting satisfaction. And it's not who we are. I can't attach myself to Tessie. I can't possess her. Actually, if you knew her, you know that was impossible anyway. But basically, it's really having that relationship that can be enjoyable, but just knowing that it's impermanent. And these thoughts come and go. So that's one thing. I adapted this from the exercise that my teacher, Matt Flickstein, did this a number of years ago. But also, letting go is an ongoing practice. Every day there's things you're going to attach to. There's the biggies I talked about, putting on the card. But there's just things you get attached to, such as you get in traffic and you get caught in traffic and you're not going anywhere and you're going to be late for wherever you're going. And you're attached to being there on time. And it's not going to happen, but you can't let go of it. So you get frustrated. You may do some unskillful gestures toward other drivers and things like that. It's not changing reality a bit. So another process that's been very useful to me and something that you might consider is what I call just the process of letting go. And this really comes from, won't go into detail about this, but the 7 factors of awakening. Because what the Buddha said is if we have a problematical situation, we need to apply 3 things. One is mindfulness, where we're paying attention moment to moment to what is. We investigate it, and we investigate it with energy and persistence. And out of that can come joy, tranquility, increased concentration, and equanimity. That those follows. You only have to do 3 things to get to 7. But the process would be as follows. And that's, first of all, developing with mindfulness the ability to recognize your suffering, to recognize that feeling, some of which you may have gotten when you were asked to pick something you had to let go of. So you know that suffering is there. And then the important thing is once you recognize that and you want to do something about it, then pause. Pause is so important because when you pause, that means you can get some distance from the issue. And after you pause, practice mindfulness of breathing, if only for a few moments. 3 or 4 breaths. I am breathing in, I am breathing out. I am breathing in, I am breathing out. And that's just getting yourself set up to really investigate. And what you want to investigate is really 3 things. First of all, what is your mental impression about this? What is actually, going on? What is your fear? What is your fear? Is it loss? Is it pain? Is it criticism? Is it disrepute? And then lastly, that really leads you to exactly what do you actually clinging to in this circumstance. Now, at Whitehall Meditation, we're having a series now on aging. Not necessarily for those who are older, but just your age just as soon as you're born. So it really applies to everyone. And how do you deal with the aging process? So just an example of this, you're looking in the mirror and you see a wrinkle that wasn't there the day before. And so you have an unpleasant feeling. And it actually could ruin your day. You see that wrinkle. So that really gets down to the fact of there's clinging here, but really, how do you investigate it? And so basically, when you see that wrinkle, and you recognize it, you pause, you may take a few breaths, and then really investigate it. And so basically, what is your perception? Your perception is you saw that wrinkle and you don't like it. And you don't like it because it's a sign that you're getting older. And you don't like that. And so what is your fear? Well, your fear is that it's going to ruin your appearance, that people are going to see you wrinkled, and therefore you're not going to be respected anymore. You're going to be thought of someone different. It's going to change your relationships. I mean, that could be one fear. There could be many, coming up. And so what are you really clinging to? And the basis of this, what you're clinging to, is that your body, you don't want your body to change. You're clinging to the permanence of your body, rather than recognizing that this is going to happen and you have no control over it. And that wrinkle, you see how it started that whole process of suffering, just by observing yourself in the mirror to see that. And so basically, what this leads to, if you stick with it, you realize that this is really what's happening. There's nothing you can do about it. It's the way things are, and it allows you to live with it. It allows you to really accept it for what it is. It doesn't mean you shouldn't take care of your body or anything like that, but it's just an example of how we cling to things and we don't really get to the bottom of what we're clinging to is actually a fear that's going on, and the fear of what? And this calls for being non-judgmental and really looking at yourself. So I'd just like to end with a quote by Douglas Pinnock about intention and letting go. He says, the path of right intention, which remember I'm talking about letting go, loving kindness, and practicing compassion. Mind is continuous motion, unstoppable. Our minds move from emotional state to emotional state. Everything that arises in expectation is tinged by dissolution and loss, sorrow and anguish. Thoughts appear and vanish, return and again dissolve. Nothing we have learned provides enduring refuge, not belief, not logic, not theory. The path of right intention is the innate power of awareness to open our minds into deeper understanding. We can move beyond the limits of our own survival. We can indeed overcome conventional desires and concepts to act selflessly for the benefit of others. So like I say, I will share a copy of this with you because I think that quote is worth reading over and over again. It's because what it's all about, mindfulness and the path, is getting down to that level of understanding where we can see how things really are and really abandon what I call the deluded search for happiness, the deluded search for permanence, for something that's going to give us lasting satisfaction, and also for just how we are. I call it the freedom of non-attachment. So anyway, it's been wonderful to be with you, and thank you. Have a good evening.